The airfield never truly slept. Even after sunset, it breathed, through generators humming beneath concrete, through distant engines being tested and shut down, through the low murmur of men who had learned to speak quietly at night. Floodlights carved long, white scars across the tarmac, illuminating aircraft parked in disciplined rows, their silhouettes heavy and motionless, like animals waiting to be awakened. At 22:40 hours, the briefing room emptied. There had been no dramatic buildup, no speeches about danger or sacrifice. The officers spoke plainly, efficiently. Night navigation exercise, extended over water flight, maintain formation, strict radio discipline, return before dawn. Routine. That word settled into the crew's minds like a promise. Routine meant predictability. Predictability meant control. Control meant survival. Pilots walked toward their aircraft with helmets tucked under their arms, boots crunching softly against gravel and concrete. Their faces showed no excitement, only habit. Some had flown combat missions. Others had crossed storms and enemy skies. Tonight felt simpler, easier, almost dull. Engines began to turn. One by one, propellers coughed, spat smoke, then settled into deep, steady roars. The vibrations passed through the ground, through steel, through bone. Inside the cockpits, instrument panels glowed dim red and amber, needles resting exactly where they should. Oil pressure stable, fuel steady, gyros aligned. Everything was normal. At 23:07, the first aircraft rolled forward. Its wheels lifted cleanly from the runway and vanished into darkness beyond the floodlights. Another followed, then another. Soon, the formation was airborne, climbing smoothly, navigation lights blinking in precise intervals. From the control tower, they looked like stars being arranged by an unseen hand. Beyond the coastline, the world disappeared. The ocean below offered no horizon, only a black surface absorbing moonlight. The sky above was no kinder. Clouds drifted like dark continents, erasing stars as they passed. Inside the cockpits, the sensation of movement came only from instruments and vibration. Visually, they were suspended in nothing. Radio traffic remained calm. Call signs checked in. Bearings were confirmed. Wind speed logged. Fuel consumption noted. The ground station answered each transmission with steady confidence. No warnings, no anomalies. At 12,000 feet, the formation leveled off. Inside one aircraft, the navigator glanced from his charts to the compass. The needle hesitated, just slightly. A flicker so small it could be ignored. He tapped the glass with a finger. The needle steadied. Probably turbulence. Outside, the night closed around them. No one noticed when the last aircraft in formation blinked once, then vanished into the clouds. No alarm sounded. No voice spoke up. Routine missions did not expect things to disappear. By mid-1942, the Pacific Ocean had become the most dangerous battlefield on Earth, not because of what could be seen, but because of what could not. Japanese merchant crews sailed through vast stretches of water, believing distance itself was protection. There were no enemy ships on the horizon, no aircraft overhead, no warning sirens, only endless blue. That illusion of safety was exactly what American submariners depended on. Beneath the surface, U.S. Navy submarines moved like ghosts. Long, dark hulls slid silently through cold water. Diesel engines shut down, electric motors barely whispering. Periscope depth. Slow ahead. Every man aboard understood the rule. If the enemy sees you, you are already dead. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine was built on outdated assumptions. Escorts were few. Sonar was primitive. Convoy discipline was inconsistent. Many captains still believed submarines were rare, fragile weapons, useful for scouting, not for systematic destruction. That belief would cost them dearly. Inside the cramped steel pressure hull of an American submarine, the atmosphere was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and tension. Men slept inches from torpedoes. Condensation dripped from pipes. The air grew stale after days submerged. Yet every crewman knew why they were there. They were hunting shipping, not warships, not glory targets, but the lifeblood of an empire. Oil tankers carrying fuel from the Dutch East Indies. Cargo ships packed with rice, ammunition, spare aircraft parts. Transports carrying troops who would never reach their destination. Each sinking was not just a ship lost, it was factories that would go silent, aircraft that would never take off, soldiers who would starve on distant islands. And most of the time, the victims never knew what killed them. A typical attack began with silence, a faint shape on the horizon, bearings calculated, speed estimated. The submarine would surface briefly at night to close distance, then submerge before dawn. Periscope up, only for seconds at a time, a thin feather of water almost invisible. Target steady, range 4,000 yards. In Japanese merchant ships, life went on as normal. Crews smoked on deck, engineers monitored engines, officers studied charts. No alarms, no evasive maneuvers, nothing to suggest that far below, steel tubes were already pointed at their hull. When torpedoes were fired, there was no warning sound, no incoming scream. Just time, measured in seconds, until impact. The explosion came from below, where no threat was expected. A violent upward odor that split hull plates, snapped keels, and tore open fuel tanks. Ships lurched. Boilers exploded. Lights went out instantly. Men were thrown into burning oil and black water, and still many survivors would later swear the same thing. There was no submarine, no wake, no periscope, no gunfire, only sudden destruction from an empty sea. American submarines would often withdraw immediately after firing, slipping deep before escorts even understood what had happened. Depth charges, when they came, were dropped blindly, exploding far above or far behind. The ocean swallowed the hunters again. By late 1942, Japanese losses were climbing at a rate no one had predicted. Entire convoys vanished. Supply schedules collapsed. Yet reports remained confused, contradictory, even dismissive. Some commanders blamed mines. Others suspected sabotage. A few claimed American aircraft had attacked unseen. The truth was far more terrifying. The enemy was there, close, patient, and unseen, and the ocean itself was helping them hide. And this was only the beginning. By early 1943, something had gone terribly wrong for the Japanese Empire. And everyone knew it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Ships were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. At first, the losses had been explained away as bad luck, then as isolated incidents. But now, the numbers no longer lied. Tankers vanished en route from Borneo. Cargo ships failed to arrive in Rabaul. Entire troop transports never reached island garrisons that were already starving, ports filled with unanswered radio messages, and ships listed as overdue, the most dangerous word in naval logistics. For Japanese sailors, the ocean itself began to feel hostile. Convoys grew nervous. Crews slept in life jackets. Lookouts strained their eyes until they burned, scanning empty horizons for threats that never showed themselves. Officers ordered sudden zigzags, unnecessary speed changes, anything to feel like they were doing something. But it didn't matter. The attacks kept coming, and always the same pattern. No warning, no enemy seen. One explosion, sometimes two, and the ship was already dying. American submarines were no longer hunting cautiously. They were becoming confident, aggressive, calculated. Commanders learned shipping lanes by memory. They studied Japanese habits, predictable routes, careless formations, escorts that drifted too far from their charges. Submarines began waiting directly in choke points, narrow straits, harbor approaches, predictable supply corridors, places where ships had to pass. Below the surface, sonar operators whispered range updates. Fire control parties tracked targets with stopwatches and grease pencils. Torpedo men stood by, hands resting on valves, waiting for the quiet command. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. The desperation above water grew worse with every sinking. Japanese escorts began dropping depth charges wildly, often without contact. Explosions shook the sea but hit nothing. Some captains released entire racks of charges in panic, exhausting their supply within minutes, leaving convoys defenseless afterward. Others tried superstition. Crews painted protective symbols on hulls. Officers prayed before departure. Sailors whispered that the Americans had learned to see through water, or that submarines were guided by spirits of the dead. Some believed the sea itself had turned against Japan. Morale cracked slowly, then all at once. Survivors from sunk ships carried stories from port to port. Ships split in half by unseen blows, men sucked down with the wreckage, burning oil turning the sea into fire. These stories spread faster than any official report, and they terrified everyone who had to sail next. American submariners noticed the change. Targets zigzagged more, convoys clustered tighter. Escorts grew aggressive but sloppy. Fear made the enemy predictable, and predictability was deadly. Still, the submarines paid a price. Depth charge attacks grew more frequent. Hulls groaned under pressure, lights shattered. Men were thrown against bulkheads as explosions thundered above them. Sometimes submarines limped away damaged, leaking, barely alive. Sometimes they didn't return at all. But for every American boat lost, dozens of Japanese ships vanished beneath the waves. By mid-1943, Japanese planners faced a nightmare scenario. The war was being strangled underwater. Factories waited for raw materials that never arrived. Aircraft sat grounded without fuel. Island garrisons were abandoned by logistics long before they were abandoned by command. The empire was bleeding, not from battlefield defeats, but from invisible knives beneath the sea. And still, the submarines remained unseen. They did not announce themselves. They did not challenge escorts. They did not seek glory. They simply waited. And when the next ship crossed their path, the ocean would once again explode from below, leaving nothing behind but wreckage, silence, and unanswered questions drifting on the waves. By late 1943, the Pacific no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a trap. For Japanese sailors, every mile traveled was a gamble, with invisible odds stacked against them. The sea lanes that once carried the lifeblood of the empire, fuel, food, ammunition, reinforcements, had become corridors of death. Ships sailed, but fewer arrived, and those that did often came scarred, damaged, or half-empty, carrying survivors instead of cargo. American submarines had learned patience. They no longer rushed attacks. They let convoys pass, counting escorts, measuring speeds, memorizing patterns. They waited for darkness, for bad weather, for moments when discipline slipped. Submarine commanders understood that fear itself was now their greatest ally. Japanese escorts tried to adapt. Destroyers hugged convoys tightly, sonar operators glued to their headsets. Depth charges were deployed with increasing violence, churning the water into boiling chaos. But the ocean absorbed the punishment and gave nothing back. Sonar contacts vanished. Attacks produced only shattered nerves and exhausted crews. Below the surface, American boats endured the counterattacks in silence. Men lay flat on steel decks as lights flickered and pipes burst. The hulls creaked like living things under pressure. Depth charges detonated close enough to bend metal, close enough to make every man believe the next one would end it all. But again and again the submarine survived, slipping deeper, drifting quietly, waiting for the enemy to grow tired. And the enemy always did. Japanese escorts were built for surface combat, not prolonged underwater hunts. Their sonar was crude, their training inconsistent. After hours of fruitless searching, fuel low and nerves frayed, they returned to their stations, convinced the threat was gone. That was when the torpedoes came. At night, ships burned like beacons. Tankers exploded into fireballs visible for miles. Cargo ships broke apart, their decks folding inward as water rushed through shattered hulls. Radios screamed for help that would never arrive in time. Lifeboats launched into seas slick with oil and debris, drifting under silent stars. And always the same question echoed among survivors. Where did the attack come from? Rumors spread faster than official orders. Some sailors claimed the Americans could see through the sea. Others believed submarines waited directly beneath harbors. Impossible, but undeniable. Entire crews developed rituals, refusing to speak certain words, tapping hulls for luck, sleeping with weapons close even though there was nothing to shoot. Commanders noticed the change in their men. Veterans grew quiet. Replacements froze during alarms. Lookouts imagined periscopes where there were none. Panic crept in slowly, then spread like rot through steel hulls. The psychological toll was devastating. Ships turned back at the slightest mechanical issue. Convoys delayed departures, afraid of sailing alone. Cargo piled up in ports while frontline units starved. Officers sent increasingly desperate messages to Tokyo, warning that maritime transport was becoming impossible. But Tokyo had no answer. Japan lacked enough escorts. It lacked radar. It lacked the industrial capacity to replace ships at the rate they were being lost. And worst of all, it lacked a way to fight an enemy that refused to reveal itself. American submarines didn't need to win battles. They only needed to deny Japan the sea. By the end of 1943, the Pacific was no longer neutral territory. It had chosen a side, and for every Japanese ship that ventured out, the ocean waited patiently, hiding steel predators that neither fired warning shots nor accepted surrender. The sea had turned hostile, and it was only getting worse. By early 1944, Japan was no longer losing ships. It was losing time. Every convoy that failed to arrive created ripples far beyond the sea. On island garrisons scattered across the Pacific, commanders opened supply manifests and saw the truth in stark numbers: fewer bullets, fewer medical supplies, fewer calories. The Empire's armies were still fighting, but they were slowly being hollowed out, and the submarines never spoke. American commanders understood something Japan did not fully grasp until it was too late. War could be won without decisive battles. You could starve an empire without ever landing an army. Submarines targeted what mattered most. Oil tankers became priority kills. Without fuel, warships stayed in port. Aircraft sat useless on runways. Training halted. Even generators failed, plunging bases into darkness at night. One tanker sunk meant dozens of operations canceled weeks later. Food followed. Rice ships disappeared at sea. Refrigerated transports carrying fish and meat never reached their destinations. On islands like Truk, Rabaul, and later the Philippines, rations were cut again and again. Soldiers learned to stretch meals, boiling weeds, trapping rats, fishing with handmade lines from bombed docks. Hunger became a constant companion. Letters from Japanese officers began to change in tone. Where once they wrote of honor and duty, they now described weakness, illness, men collapsing during drills. Malaria spread faster among undernourished troops. Wounds that would have healed became fatal infections, all without a single enemy soldier in sight. At sea, fear deepened. Convoys sailed only at night, hugging coastlines, hoping shallow water would protect them. But submarines followed anyway. They waited offshore, listening, calculating. When escorts peeled away to investigate phantom contacts, lone ships were left exposed. Easy prey. Japanese sailors learned to fear calm seas. Smooth water revealed torpedo wakes too late to evade. Moonlight silhouetted ships against the horizon. Even silence became terrifying. Engines throttled down, crews whispering, knowing that somewhere below someone might already be lining up the shot. The Americans refined their methods. Wolf packs coordinated attacks. Radar guided submarines into firing positions even in darkness and storms. Torpedoes, once unreliable, now detonated with brutal consistency. A single patrol could sink more tonnage than entire surface fleets had in earlier wars. Japanese command tried to respond. New convoy routes were drawn, escorts reassigned, training manuals rewritten. But every solution arrived months late, undermined by shortages of fuel, steel, and trained crews. Shipyards worked constantly, yet could not replace losses fast enough. The math was merciless. More ships were leaving service than entering it. Every sunk vessel was a permanent wound. Every drowned sailor was experience lost forever. By mid-1944, entire Japanese divisions were fighting on half rations. Aircraft units cannibalized planes for spare parts that never arrived. Naval bases stockpiled ammunition they could no longer move. The Empire was still armed, but it was starving, and the men in submarines knew it. They didn't celebrate victories. They logged them. Tonnage sunk. Coordinates. Time. Weather. Then they submerged again, slipping back into the vastness, letting silence do the rest. No announcements, no warnings, no mercy. Japan was being strangled slowly, not by bombs, not by invasions, but by an unseen war beneath the waves. And the worst part for Tokyo was this: there was no way to fight back against something you could not see, could not catch, and could not stop. The sea had gone quiet, and that silence was killing the empire. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was escorting ghosts. On paper, convoys still existed. Routes were planned, timetables drawn, orders stamped and issued. But in reality, every voyage had become a gamble against an enemy that had already learned all the rules and then broken them. The submarines had adapted faster than Japan ever could. Where Japanese escorts relied on outdated sonar and visual lookouts, American boats used radar, radio intelligence, and shared patrol data. Submarines were no longer lone hunters. They were nodes in a silent network, handing off targets, predicting routes, waiting where ships had to pass. Japanese commanders tried to change tactics. Convoys were reduced in size to avoid detection, then increased again to concentrate protection. Escorts zigzagged, then held steady courses. Depth charges were dropped at the slightest hint of a contact, sometimes dozens at once, emptying magazines against shadows and imagination. It didn't matter. The submarines learned their patterns within days. American skippers discovered that escorts grew careless after hours without contact, that depth charges were often dropped too shallow, that sonar operators mistook whales, wreckage, even thermal layers for submarines, and real submarines for nothing at all. Patience won every time. A typical attack now took hours, sometimes days. A submarine would trail a convoy from beyond visual range, running silent during daylight, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and reposition. The crew memorized the silhouettes of each ship, tanker, freighter, escort, learning which carried fuel, which carried troops, which one had to be sunk first. Then came the moment, often at night, often in rain, often with no moon. A single torpedo would streak into the darkness and explode beneath a transport's keel. The ship would break its back and vanish in minutes. Escorts would charge off, dropping depth charges where the submarine had been, not where it was going. Meanwhile, the submarine slipped away beneath the chaos. Sometimes they struck again. Japanese escort commanders began to feel hunted. They knew the submarines were there, but not where. Every radar contact might be false. Every sonar ping might be delayed. Every order carried the weight of possible disaster. Sleep became impossible. On bridges, officers stared into black water, convinced they were being watched. Below decks, sailors flinched at every sound, the creak of steel, the hiss of valves, mistaking them for torpedoes. Morale collapsed quietly. Reports sent to Tokyo grew desperate. Escorts were requesting better equipment that industry could no longer provide. Fuel shortages limited training. Veteran sailors were gone, replaced by rushed recruits with barely weeks of instruction. Depth charges were dropped by men who had never seen a submarine and might never survive their first encounter. Meanwhile, American submariners grew bolder. They attacked in daylight. They fired from inside convoys. They surfaced to use deck guns against stragglers. Some commanders began deliberately targeting escorts, not to sink them all, but to wound them. A damaged destroyer meant one less hunter on future patrols. A limping escort tied up resources Japan no longer had. The ocean became a killing ground of attrition. By this stage of the war, Japan was losing not just ships, but confidence in the sea itself. Merchant captains delayed departures, citing mechanical issues that did not exist. Crews deserted when possible. Some ships sailed with skeleton crews, unable to replace the dead. And still, they sailed, because they had no choice. Factories needed fuel, garrisons needed food. The war demanded movement, even when movement meant death. American submarines understood this inevitability. They waited at choke points. They waited at harbors. They waited along coastlines where ships hugged land in false hope of safety, and one on the math was merciless. More ships were leaving service than entering it. Every sunk vessel was a permanent wound. Every drowned sailor was experience lost forever. By mid-1944, entire Japanese divisions were fighting on half rations. Aircraft units cannibalized planes for spare parts that never arrived. Naval bases stockpiled ammunition they could no longer move. The empire was still armed, But it was starving, and the men in submarines knew it. They didn't celebrate victories. They logged them. Tonnage sunk, coordinates, time, weather. Then they submerged again, slipping back into the vastness, letting silence do the rest. No announcements, no warnings, no mercy. Japan was being strangled slowly, not by bombs, not by invasions, but by an unseen war beneath the waves. And the worst part for Tokyo was this: there was no way to fight back against something you could not see, could not catch, and could not stop. The sea had gone quiet, and that silence was killing the empire. By early 1945, the Pacific itself seemed hostile to Japan. The sea no longer felt like a highway. It felt like a trap. American submarines had achieved something no fleet battle ever had: total psychological dominance. Japanese sailors no longer believed survival was a matter of skill or discipline. It was luck, and luck was running out. The numbers told the story brutally. More than half of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. Oil tankers were priority targets, and the submariners knew it. Without fuel, destroyers could not escort. Without escort, convoys could not sail. Without convoys, islands starved. Submarine captains now received target lists ranked by strategic value. Oil first, ammunition second. Troops last, unless they were officers. American intelligence units broke Japanese naval codes with terrifying consistency. Routes changed, departure times shifted, escorts reassigned, and the submarines were already waiting. To Japanese commanders, it felt impossible. Every adjustment failed, every deception was anticipated, every safe route became deadly within weeks. Some officers began to suspect betrayal. They accused radio operators of leaking signals, executed sailors for imagined mistakes, replaced experienced captains with fanatics who promised obedience over competence. It only made things worse. The escorts still relied on depth charges designed for World War I assumptions. Sonar sets struggled with thermal layers common in the Pacific. American submarines learned to exploit these blind zones, resting motionless beneath layers of warm water while destroyers raged uselessly above. Sometimes escorts circled for hours, dropping explosives until their decks were bare. The submarines listened, counted the explosions, measured the patterns, waited, then slipped away. In some cases, Japanese escorts abandoned sinking transports to chase phantom contacts, leaving the hundreds of men to drown while the submarine quietly lined up its next shot. There was no heroism left at sea, only routine death. Survivors spoke of ships vanishing without warning. No battle, no exchange of fire, just a sudden explosion beneath the keel, a violent upward lurch, then darkness and cold water, filled with oil and screams. Submariners began to recognize the signs of a broken enemy. Zigzag patterns became sloppy. Lookouts stopped scanning. Convoys bunched together out of fear, making them perfect targets. Some American commanders described it as hunting exhausted animals, not because the enemy lacked courage, but because they lacked options. Japan's industrial collapse sealed the outcome. Replacement ships were impossible. New sonar sets never arrived. Fuel shortages forced escorts to train less and patrol shorter ranges. The ocean belonged to the submarines now. By mid-1945, some Japanese ships sailed with orders not to radio if attacked, to avoid revealing routes. Others carried sealed instructions to be opened only if intercepted. Most never opened them. Entire crews vanished with no witnesses, no wreckage, no survivors. The sea swallowed them quietly. American submariners began to realize something unsettling. They were no longer fighting a navy. They were dismantling an economy. Every ship sunk meant factories without fuel, airfields without aviation gas, hospitals without medicine. The war was being strangled from beneath the waves, and the enemy could do nothing about it. The Pacific had turned into an execution ground, one torpedo at a time, and still the submarines remained unseen, waiting for the last ships brave or desperate enough to sail. By early 1945, the Pacific itself seemed hostile to Japan. The sea no longer felt like a highway. It felt like a trap. American submarines had achieved something no fleet battle ever had: total psychological dominance. Japanese sailors no longer believed survival was a matter of skill or discipline. It was luck, and luck was running out. The numbers told the story brutally. More than half of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. Oil tankers were priority targets, and the submariners knew it. Without fuel, destroyers could not escort. Without escort, convoys could not sail. Without convoys, islands starved. Submarine captains now received target lists ranked by strategic value. Oil first, ammunition second. Troops last, unless they were officers. American intelligence units broke Japanese naval codes with terrifying consistency. Routes changed, departure times shifted, escorts reassigned, and the submarines were already waiting. To Japanese commanders, it felt impossible. Every adjustment failed, every deception was anticipated, every safe route became deadly within weeks. Some officers began to suspect betrayal. They accused radio operators of leaking signals, executed sailors for imagined mistakes, replaced experienced captains with fanatics who promised obedience over competence. It only made things worse. The escort still relied on depth charges designed for World War I assumptions. Sonar sets struggled with thermal layers common in the Pacific. American submarines learned to exploit these blind zones, resting motionless beneath layers of warm water while destroyers raged uselessly above. Sometimes escorts circled for hours, dropping explosives until their decks were bare. The submarines listened, counted the explosions, measured the patterns, waited, then slipped away. In some cases, Japanese escorts abandoned sinking transports to chase phantom contacts, leaving the hundreds of men to drown while the submarine quietly lined up its next shot. There was no heroism left at sea, only routine death. Survivors spoke of ships vanishing without warning. No battle, no exchange of fire, just a sudden explosion beneath the keel, a violent upward lurch, then darkness and cold water, filled with oil and screams. Submariners began to recognize the signs of a broken enemy. Zigzag patterns became sloppy. Lookouts stopped scanning. Convoys bunched together out of fear, making them perfect targets. Some American commanders described it as hunting exhausted animals, not because the enemy lacked courage, but because they lacked options. Japan's industrial collapse sealed the outcome. Replacement ships were impossible. New sonar sets never arrived. Fuel shortages forced escorts to train less and patrol shorter ranges. The ocean belonged to the submarines now. By mid-1945, some Japanese ships sailed with orders not to radio if attacked, to avoid revealing routes. Others carried sealed instructions to be opened only if intercepted. Most never opened them. Entire crews vanished with no witnesses, no wreckage, no survivors. The sea swallowed them quietly. American submariners began to realize something unsettling. They were no longer fighting a navy. They were dismantling an economy. Every ship sunk meant factories without fuel, airfields without aviation gas, hospitals without medicine. The war was being strangled from beneath the waves, and the enemy could do nothing about it. The Pacific had turned into an execution ground, one torpedo at a time, and still the submarines remained unseen, waiting for the last ships brave or desperate enough to sail. By the summer of 1945, there were two wars in the Pacific. One was visible, islands burning, cities bombed, fleets destroyed in headlines and communiques. The other happened unseen. It took place beneath the surface in cold darkness, where steel hulls moved like predators and men fought a war measured not in miles, but in seconds and meters. American submariners now understood something few historians would fully grasp until decades later. Japan had already lost the war at sea even before the bombs fell on its cities. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 90% of Japan's oil imports were gone. Entire refineries stood idle not because they were bombed, but because tankers never arrived. Warships sat useless in harbors, fuel gauges empty, crews drilling for battles they would never fight. The Imperial Navy still existed, but only on paper. Submarines had done what surface fleets and air power alone could not. They had severed arteries, strangled logistics, turned distance into a weapon. Japanese soldiers on isolated islands felt the effects immediately. Rations were cut again and again. Medical supplies vanished. Ammunition was rationed to the last rounds. Men starved while surrounded by ocean. And still, Tokyo ordered ships to sail. The final convoys were tragic things. Old freighters, repaired hulls, crews of teenagers and wounded veterans, escorts with barely functioning sonar and depth charges so old they sometimes failed to detonate. Many of these ships sailed knowing they would not return. Some carried sealed orders instructing captains to destroy documents and scuttle if attacked. Others carried no orders at all, just hope. The submarines waited anyway. American skippers no longer felt the rush of early war patrols. This was not excitement. It was inevitability. Targets appeared on radar exactly where intelligence predicted. Courses matched decoded messages. Speeds revealed fuel shortages. It became mechanical. Detect, track, fire, withdraw. Sometimes there was no resistance at all. A torpedo would strike and no escort would respond, either because none remained or because fuel constraints forced them to abandon the area. Survivors floated for days. No rescue came. American crews saw them through periscopes, clinging to wreckage, waving, screaming, and then disappeared beneath the waves as the submarine slipped away. Orders were clear. Rescue endangered the boat, endangered the mission, endangered the war effort. This was the war beneath the war, and it was merciless. Inside Japanese naval headquarters, the truth was known. Reports spoke openly of shipping annihilation. Charts showed routes that no longer functioned. Planners admitted they could no longer supply their own forces. But the orders continued. Because surrender was unthinkable, some officers believed a miracle might still come. A decisive battle, a new weapon, an American mistake. Instead, the submarines kept firing. By August, Japan's merchant marine was effectively dead. What remained were wrecks, wreckage, and empty ocean. The sea that once connected an empire now isolated it completely. And then the bombs fell. When news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached American submarine crews, reactions were mixed. Some cheered, others sat in silence. Many already knew they had watched Japan bleed out slowly, invisibly beneath the waves. The bombs ended the war. But the submarines had already ended Japan's ability to fight it. They had won without parades, without photographs, without witnesses. Only silence marked their victory, and silence was their greatest weapon. When the order finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. Cease offensive patrols. Proceed to designated areas. Await further instructions. For men who had spent years stalking shadows across empty oceans, the war did not end with celebration. It ended with stillness. American submarines surfaced one by one. Gray hulls broke the water that had been their home, battlefield, and shield. Crews stood on decks blinking in the sunlight, thinner than when they had sailed, quieter than victory suggested. They had survived a war no one saw. Behind them lay the true graveyard of the Pacific. More than 1,100 Japanese merchant ships destroyed. Millions of tons of cargo sent to the seabed. An empire starved, isolated, and hollowed out from beneath. No decisive fleet battle, no final armada annihilated in one day. Just relentless pressure, patrol after patrol, until nothing moved anymore. Post-war analysts struggled to explain it. Air power was visible. Battleships were symbolic. Marines raised flags. But submarines? They left no ruins, no scorched cities, no captured territory, only absence. Japanese post-war records told the real story. Factories shut down not from bombing, but lack of fuel. Armies immobilized not by defeat, but starvation. Warships rusting at anchor, unable to sail. One Japanese naval officer wrote in his diary shortly before surrender, "We still have soldiers, we still have weapons, but the sea is no longer ours." The submarines had taken it. Many American submariners returned home to silence. No headlines, no crowds. Sometimes no one believed their stories. How do you explain sinking a ship no one ever saw sink? How do you describe a victory measured in missing supplies and empty harbors? Even decades later, reunions were quiet affairs. Old men would sit together, barely speaking, knowing the others understood what could not be explained. They remembered the hum of electric motors, the creak of pressure hulls, the moment after firing when the ocean held its breath, the explosion distant and muffled, then nothing. No cheers, no confirmation, just a new contact already forming on the scope. Historians would later say that American submarines shortened the war by years. Some argue they saved millions of lives, Japanese and Allied alike, by making invasion impossible for Japan to resist. But for the men who served beneath the waves, the legacy was simpler. They had done their job. They had followed orders. They had vanished into darkness so others could fight in daylight. And when the war ended, they vanished again, back into civilian life, carrying memories as deep and heavy as the ocean they left behind. No monuments mark where most of it happened, no crosses, no plaques, no names, just water, still moving, still silent, just like the submarines that won the war beneath it.